At what point can you call someone an alcoholic? First of all, just to be clear from the start, you don't. But by all means, let that be a personal opinion for another day. When I was still living in my black or white world, I always imagined alcoholics as people who completely looked the part. With that I mean shabby looks, rotten teeth, bad smell, and in worst cases jobless and even homeless. And sure, it may apply to some, but in general, I now realize that's just a very naive and distorted impression. I used to work part-time at a cafe and I thought it was obvious who were the so-called drunks. Little did I know that I would find out the hard way how oblivious I was concerning the whole matter. As a child, I sometimes spent the night at my grandparents'. This one time I was there alone with my grandmother watching TV when my grandfather came home and was completely wasted. He didn't lay a finger on us, but he was very loud and angry, shouting he would smash the TV and break down the house. At first I didn't tell my mother, but later on I did, and I wasn't allowed to go there for months. I didn't really understand, and I remember blaming my mother for that. Now I know that she experienced that same situation a lot while growing up, and even worse. I also remember this moment. I think I was about 8 or 9 years old when I found my father lying on the floor of the garage. He was awake but acted very weird. He was crying a lot and his words didn't make any sense, so I got scared and called my mother and brother. We took him inside and all he did was cry and say he felt like he was 100 years old and that he was going to die. Again, I didn't understand. A short while after that, I remember him waking me up one day to say he was going away for a short period because he needed help. Since then, I didn't really notice anything of him abusing alcohol, but the last couple of years he did say a few times that he would stop drinking in general. A year and a half ago, he finally explained in detail about how serious it actually was, which took me by surprise, and ever since he goes to the weekly AA meetings. We are all huge fans of labeling things or people, putting everything into different categories. I myself am guilty of that too, even though I try to avoid it, but my brain sometimes needs it just to be able to get a grasp on a situation. And if you're an overthinker like me, you can easily get confused because of all the different names and grey areas out there. Alcoholism is one of them. To achieve the title of an alcoholic, you apparently need to drink a certain amount each day, and it's different if you're a man or a woman. If you don't meet the criteria, it's also possible, according to science that is, you can just be a binge drinker, or a high intensity drinker, or maybe a heavy drinker, also called a problem drinker. You see where I got stuck there? Another label ruined for life. So I decided to cut the crap and turn inwards, yet again. Instead of counting and defining the how much, I mainly focused on the why. A part of me always knew I was sensitive to any kind of addiction. As a child, it manifested mostly in binge eating. In my teens, I started smoking, and I guess somewhere along the way, alcohol also made its entrance. I always considered myself a social drinker and didn't experience any problems. I enjoyed the buzz it gave me, and I got very skilled in hiding it from my mother when I got home drunk. Sounds like any normal teenager, right? But looking back on it now, I must say I started to look forward to that buzz. I wasn't a nasty drunk, on the contrary. I felt my boundaries fading and was mostly all about the love. I felt this kind of freedom and experienced a world where I only felt good, or at least untouchable for the bad. Unfortunately, the latter wasn't real, and I have been very lucky to escape a few situations that could have ended pretty badly. When I was 20, I went traveling abroad for a year, and the party-hardy vibe did reach a peak back then. At one point, I started to dislike the person I was becoming. When I got back, it was time for adulthood, so I went back to school and eventually met my future husband. My life was more settled down, and so was my social life. I must say alcohol was still included, but it was more laid back and subtle. A simple lunch or gathering with friends always included multiple glasses of wine. It made me feel relaxed and created a soothing atmosphere. It did get worse during the episodes when my depression manifested. Those times gave my social drinking a totally different meaning. Instead of casually drinking with company, I would drink alone at home and enjoy a relaxing evening with my bottled friend. It felt like heaven. The pressure that had been building up inside all day disappeared immediately with the first sip. The hangovers and blackouts were just collateral damage I was able to incorporate. I was lucky enough to have my conscience kick in after a while and made me reflect on what kind of person I was turning into and who I actually wanted to be. So after binging for a couple of months, I was able to pull myself together and stop the drinking. I went months without and didn't drink during my pregnancy, so I convinced myself I didn't really have a problem with alcohol. I sometimes just had these rough periods in my life like everyone else, but in the end I always managed to stop. And that's how it goes. You want to believe the nonsense you keep telling yourself, and in the meantime you don't realize how self-destructive your behavior is and how fast it actually goes. So the last few years, while my anxiety got the best of me and really came to the fore, I found it harder and harder to restrain myself. The alcohol stops became shorter and the need for numbness stronger. In the beginning, I held myself back from drinking on the days my children were with me, but with my anxiety increasing, that didn't last. I waited until they went to bed, so I justified it by fooling myself I didn't harm them since I didn't drink in front of them. But I did have the hangovers, so the mornings were brutal. I struggled to get out of bed and had really bad morning moods. I was fighting and shaming myself during the day, but that didn't stop me from starting again in the evening. I also looked forward to the moment they went back to their father, because my stress level peaked and I knew I wouldn't have any reason left to hold myself back. So before I knew it, this was my life. 7 days of drinking and neglecting myself and the whole world, alternated with 7 days of fighting my urges and trying to function for my children, which of course only contributed to my feelings of anxiety, shame and guilt. It all went down so quickly and I really hated myself for being so weak and not being able to keep control over myself. I felt like hell most of the time and I knew I was ruining my life, but I just held on so strongly to those couple of hours I didn't have to think or feel anything. Luckily, I wasn't completely lost. I still had this minuscule, stubborn part in me that wouldn't let go. After doing so much hard work on myself to heal, that part convinced me I got stuck in the process because of the alcohol. It was time for me to make a choice. And let me tell you, it might sound like an easy and obvious one, but it sure isn't. You often hear these testimonies of people who quit drinking and are raving about all the advantages of doing so. And they are completely right, without a doubt. But it's also a huge struggle that goes along with the long grieving process. Every day of sobriety feels like day one, because when you open your eyes in the morning, the fight begins all over again. I feel so much better by not drinking. It does wonders for my mood, my anxiety level, my body, my brain, and my general functioning. But, and this is a big one, I really miss it. There are times I feel like I am being punished, and the thought of never being able to have a nice glass of wine scares me. On the other hand, I also think that those feelings are a confirmation that I do have a problem and I have to take responsibility for that. It's a matter of one day at a time and finding the strength to never give up, even after falling for the 100th time.